Talk about a hard act to follow.
Yeah. Well, we only have the perspective of mere mortals, so you'll have to forgive us that. So, I'm Jeremy Melvin. I'm the president of the board of the Sargent House Museum. And with me this afternoon are John Newhall, a scholar of American religion and doctoral student at Boston University. The Reverend...
Masters.
Okay. The Reverend Janet Parsons, who I think we've already met, but the minister of this church. And Hilary Robinson, professor of sociology and law at Northeastern University. Thank you all three for being here today with us. So when de Tocqueville visited the United States in 1831, he was struck by the spirit of association that led Americans to form civic groups of all kinds and for all different purposes, but particularly for religious purposes. And he said, Americans combine notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible for them to conceive one without the other. And religion remains a very important aspect of American life, and much more important in our society than in that of most other Western democracies. Over 50% of Americans say that religion is very important to them, whereas in most other Western democracies, the rates are much lower, sometimes as low as in the single digits. So why do you think religion is so important in the United States, not just historically, but today? And what is the connection we feel between religious practice and political liberty?
I'm willing to offer something on that. I was considering this, and I was thinking that, of course, America is such a unique society in that we come from everywhere. And as as people emigrated here, they had to seek out people of their own backgrounds and religious traditions. And so I think that church was particularly important here. You think about the examples of things like a Polish language church, a German language church, Italian language churches here, certainly in Gloucester, Portuguese. And so I think that church was particularly important here as a source of preserving identity, and also an opportunity to find the people that you most closely related to. And for me, the connection with our government is that it was easier here because it was allowed. There wasn't an established church. You were welcome to form your own as soon as you had a large enough group of people who could join you. And that is what the foundation, the underpinning of our government system, our Constitution, allowed to happen.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different threads running through. For example, like different Western nations have different approaches to how church and state are separated. For example, in France, it's a much harder line about presentation. And I knew a woman who would have to hide her cross necklace whenever she would go into a government building in France. And so there's different ways of going about it, as well as like there is freedom of religion within England, but there's also Church of England, of which the monarch is the head of the church. And so we have this strange system in America that was controversial even in its adoption. I mean, Massachusetts was the final state to sign on to ratify the First Amendment, specifically because of the separation of church and state, because of the Unitarians, really. But the refusal to relinquish that power held until 1833 in Massachusetts fully. And so it's interesting to see, especially I think we're going to get into the rise of religious right and new forms of that later, but the way that religion has been separated, has been very very confused, I think, is the best way of speaking of it.
So the French example, the French example is interesting because, of course, the French infamously banned the burqa. And so it seems to me that the more rigorous banning and the hostility to religion, to religious expression that can flow from the idea that something that has to be banned or, suppressed implies something dangerous about it. And then, of course, I'll tell a little story from having lived in Copenhagen in Denmark, where there is a state church, the Lutheran church, and I was, with my boyfriend at the time. There were a bunch of issues with green cards, so we had an immigration marriage, and I found myself in the Lutheran church with a tenor and a mezzo-soprano getting married in a church as a state activity, because it was the town hall was not available. So there was a sort of equivalency between state activities of the state and activities that could be carried out by the church on behalf of the state, but yet a deep atheism in the population. So this would be maybe at the other end of the extreme, where state and church are unified, and maybe this drives a kind of animosity towards religion that ultimately ends in a place of sort of hands-off. I think you're onto something, and Tocqueville was onto something as well, that we have struck a rather unique balance with a great diversity of freedom of religious expression, without although it increases now, I suppose, the hostility that we've seen other places to religious expression that takes shape, especially in visible forms, like wearing particular kinds of clothes.
We'd like to open it up for questions now. There is someone coming around with a microphone, so please wait for the microphone to be brought to you before speaking. Okay. So just raise your hand. There are some questions over here, I think.
On the question of religious freedoms, what happens when two groups have conflicting sense of what their liberty is? I'm thinking of the issues around sexuality. When one religious group will say that it is against their freedom to have to acknowledge homosexual relationships, and then how do you deal when religion is out to take away other people's rights on the basis of its religious belief?
That really speaks to the existence of the Bill of Rights. In general, the purpose of it being, it gives every single one of us standing to fight back. What the Bill of Rights does is gives us all permission, gives citizens permission to assert their own rights. Well, obviously, this is why, the makeup of courts is incredibly important. Somebody else?
Yeah, the cake baking case is the preeminent contemporary one on this subject matter. That if you don't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding, can you refuse to do that? The protections in the Constitution are intended to be exerted, except for the 14th Amendment, against state power. So the 14th Amendment says no person shall be enslaved in the jurisdiction of the United States. It applies to private actors and market transactions. The rest of them are referenced to the state oppressing you in some kind of way, meaning the organized government. I don't have an answer to your question, but that question is at the core of that case. And I think it's a 5-4 split. Yeah.
And it isn't just the cake baking, it's even accommodations or a landlord being able to not rent. Whereas if it was a racial thing, there's protections. But if it's a sexual thing, a landlord may have the right to not rent a something.
Yeah, we may be at the beginning of rights development in that direction. Of course, the way that private companies, private market players were forced to desegregate started with movement in the interstate highways and the fact that blacks couldn't travel because or found it very difficult to, because you couldn't get a meal or a hotel off the highway. And so the creeping in of the state's regulation of interstate commerce and to the requirement that you had to give accommodation in like public highways, and then ultimately desegregation of lunch counters. So again, these things do develop piecemeal, and so I imagine the ACLU and other intentional litigants have a whole strategy around this. Yeah.
I see some other hands up.
So I think Susan's.
Hilary brought up a statement about the practice of religion. I mean, if you go into a church on Sunday, it's not the majority of the people in this country who are attending churches, I think. So what is the difference, or is politics being used, or is religion being used in politics where it really isn't an issue of, I'm not saying this very well, but I think politics uses religion as an excuse for some of the issues that are pushed, or so perhaps somebody on the panel there can eke out what I'm trying to say, or I didn't say it well enough at all. The fact is, not that many people go to church, but they pull the religious thing. They pull the religious card.
It's a means of exercising power. Couldn't hear me? Okay. Okay. I think that pulling the religious card, as you put it, is a way to exercise power. And I think that what we've been mentioning here as we become become increasingly secular as a society, that I think that some people are sensing that there's a vacuum being created that they might be able to move into and exploit. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
I have a comment and a question. So following up, the 14th Amendment was specifically enacted after the Civil War because one of the rationalizations of the Confederacy was religion, and there was a different religion belief there that Jefferson Davis and the members of the Confederacy advocated states' rights so that they could enact and keep people enslaved under their version of Christianity. So the 14th Amendment specifically was enacted to deal with the ability of the states to not abrogate individual rights of enslaved people in many of the Confederate states and all over the country. And Lincoln came down on this side, and I think this is important for people to understand that there is a check on the right of states through the 14th Amendment, which I think is what you're saying. Is that correct, Hilary?
That's completely correct. When I said that slavery shall not exist, I was actually talking about the 13th Amendment, and you're right, the 13th and the 14th work together, and the 14th is how we got Reconstruction, how we get federal troops in the South, and how we get the return of slaves. Yes, everything you said, exactly.
Before I give up the mic, I just want to say something. The purpose of the Gloucester 400 and what our goal was to illustrate how much Gloucester has done for the world. We've fed the world. Did you know that there were more veterans during World War II from Gloucester per capita than any other community in Massachusetts? Did you know about Clarence Birdseye? So Gloucester's become a model for demonstrating acceptance of Indigenous, acceptance of the fact that we had slaves here, and we're very proud of our work. And this was one effort that showed that something really good happened from Gloucester, Massachusetts.